Hey everybody, thanks so much for coming to this talk. My name is Andrew. Today I'll be talking about strategies for dealing with uncertainty as a product manager. A little bit of background about this talk. It's a little bit of a kind of a personal therapy session for myself because uncertainty as a product manager is this big beast. You know, it's like this pervading force that exists for all of us. It's really tough to grapple with. And I think the more that we talk about it and the more we talk about strategies and actual tactics for addressing it, the more we can all get better as product managers for dealing with this really hairy beast of uncertainty that appears every day in all we do in product management. So cool. I'll just go ahead and get started then. All right, so a little bit about me. So I most recently was working on the growth team at LinkedIn, but currently I'm working on some election technology for the 2020 election. So really cool, interesting problem space there. Prior to that, I was working as a product manager and senior product manager at an ed tech startup. Prior to that, I was working at a sales software startup. So was an engineer there. A lot of fun, interesting background, and in my time, which seems to be much less nowadays, I like to do a little art and music and things like that. Cool. So what have I worked on? What kind of products? So as I mentioned at LinkedIn, I was on the growth team. I was specifically on the network growth team, working on the My Network product. So if you go to linkedin.com and you go to that tab next to the home screen, you'll see the My Network page. So that's the product I worked on with our team. Some other things I've worked on, some ed tech, as I mentioned. Here's a screenshot, and most recently, political tech. All right, so let's jump right into the agenda. So as I said, this is going to be a little bit of a let's all get into this together and exercise this demon of uncertainty, just so that we can better address it in our day-to-day as product managers. So number one, straight off the bat, uncertainty is just the reality for product managers. Like, it exists in our strategy, our road mapping, our prioritization, when things change and shift constantly. And a lot of it has to do with the general psychology of uncertainty, which we'll touch upon a little bit. And then we're going to dive into these individual sections about what does in strategy look like specifically, how having true norths and vision and mission and metrics can help, and having product principles will really help as well. Then we'll talk about uncertainty. So how to manage expectations and things like that in terms of the actual expectation and timelines. We'll talk about RAID, which is a nice framework for doing this. Risk, assumptions, issues, and dependencies. Then we'll talk about, in my opinion, what is the most important part of all this, which is communicating. So general communication and managing expectations, given that we have all this uncertainty, and how having a culture of accepting uncertainty, whether that be at your company or your individual team, can actually help. And how it's not about certainty, really, it's about coherence. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll close with a nice, fun note, which is that as PMs, what we're really doing is solving for uncertainty for our users. All right, so let's get into it. Uncertainty equals reality. All right, what do we mean by this? So just a quick little snippet of what this might mean in a statement, which is that product managers are responsible for handling uncertainty, which you may also think of as ambiguity, and are responsible to instill confidence across all stakeholders. And so if we really distill this down, it's uncertainty is the reality of our job, and we must be comfortable with it because people look to us. Like, we are the leads for our team, we're the owners of our product, and it's our responsibility, it's our duty to actually handle this uncertainty and instill confidence in our stakeholders. Okay, so why is uncertainty reality? Well, uncertainty is unavoidable in building products because, I mean, the simple fact is that it's just really complicated. And anytime you have moving pieces, you have milestones, you have releases, you're working at the intersection of different teams. Everyone has different expectations, everyone has different goals. You just boil that all of that down into uncertainty and understanding that it's unavoidable in building products for just by definition of the role we have. Um, I like to think of product management as a it's to me it's like one of the best roles in the world, right? Because we get to sit in the intersection of everything. But with all that responsibility come power comes all that great power comes great responsibility. And the responsibility is that we're in the middle of it, like we're in the mess of it. And so our goal as product managers should be to trust other teammates. It should be to empower other teammates. It should be to support each other on our other functions on our team, and to help manage that uncertainty. And the way we do this is by learning to mitigate risks, and putting in the right practices, putting in the right systems to build up a portfolio of successes of dealing with risk and uncertainty that then translates directly into building trust with your team. And then it's a virtuous cycle from there. Like the more trust you have with your teammates, the more that they will allow you in a lot of ways to operate in uncertainty. Leads to a better culture of trust and innovation, and it's just all good once we crack the nut of dealing with uncertainty. So that's why it's so important to just lay this out. This is like the first slide, right? It's like, this is the reality, and this is what we should start with. All right, so getting a little bit more granular, what do we mean by, uncertainty is a reality? Well, let's be more specific. It's everywhere. So the three areas that we'll focus on today are uncertainty in strategy, in your roadmap, and prioritization. So this is a great resource from craft.io over here on the right. They lay it out as like 3 W's. So there's uncertainty and decision making in each of these 3 W's, which is, where is the product going? So that's your strategy, right? Like where are we going? Like where's the direction? And then what features should be developed? That's your roadmap. When should each feature be developed? So that's like sequencing, like what's the actual ordering and why? And the why is under all of this, right? It's like, where are we going and why? What are we building and why? And then when are we doing it and why? And the more that we have clarity around that, the more confidence it instills in our team. And then that just leads to overall better decisions being made, right? What's not to like about that? So this is obviously a very simplified version of like laying the lay of the land of where uncertainty appears in the product management role. But I think it's a good mental model to have, like just, in your day-to-day when you're working with different teams and you're thinking about what you're doing today, like, or this week. Think about, are you trying to address the where? So like, are you in a strategy meeting? Are you trying to address the what? Like, are you in a quarterly planning meeting where you're determining what's going to be on the roadmap? And then the when? It's like, all right, well, which thing are we going to ship first? Is it initiative X or is it initiative Y? And so in each of those scenarios, there's just uncertainty. Like there's no such thing as being 100% certain about each of those things. So it's just a good mental model to have, these 3 W's. All right, so this is just a very brief overview of the psychology of uncertainty. To me personally, like this is the most exciting part of this entire topic, which is that we're like pretty hardwired as humans to avoid uncertainty. I mean, this is not a conjecture. Like there's just tons of studies that have shown this. And so because of that, we always find it difficult to accept the truth that no matter what, there will always be uncertainty, like even after our best efforts. So one I guess it's not really people like that illustrates this is the general aversion to ambiguity. This is where it gets really interesting when you get into like decision theory, economics, and things like that. But it states that the preference for known risks over unknown risks. So it's not a simplification of that we just don't like uncertainty. Is that we actually prefer known risks over unknown risks. So it's like, hey, why do you go to the same restaurant? It's like, well, I know for sure I can get this amazing this amazing dish. I'm not even going to try somewhere else. And over here to the right is another really cool model. It's called the 4 levels of residual uncertainty. This is more around like business strategy, but it's basically a framework for identifying the risks that still exist even after we do an analysis. So even after we do this like super intensive analysis of what uncertainties there are that we're dealing with, you'll still have four levels remaining. Like level 1 is you have this super clear future. Level 2 is you at least have a couple of alternatives. Level 3 is this broader range. So now it starts getting a little messy already. It starts getting really sloppy there. And then number 4 is that you just have straight up uncertainty. Like you just have no idea. So I think the key takeaway from this before we go into the next part and like really deep dive is that if we start labeling and identifying parts of uncertainty and like breaking it down, it just gives us more control over the topic. And we're able to then talk about it in a way that is much more analytical. It's a lot more specific and precise. And so to me personally, at least as a product manager, as a product practitioner, it's just more control. So it's just having more control around the topic of this messiness and chaos that is inevitable when we deal with product management. Cool. All right, so let's jump right into our first session, which is uncertainty and strategy specifically. So as we mentioned, strategy is where, right? It's like, where are we even going? I mean, I've definitely worked on, like I've worked on teams where we've had really clear strategy, almost to the point where there was a doc and you could just read, you could just access the doc whenever. I've also worked on teams where we didn't have a strategy at all. And of course, it's determined on a number of factors, whether or not you're at like an early stage startup or if you're like at a super mature company, like that has a huge impact on what your strategy, the like degree of certainty around your strategy. But one thing is for sure, which is that you should know your true north, whether that be like your true north of vision and mission. And then of course, what follows is metrics. I've given a talk here about specifically around this like topic in general. So of course we can talk about this at length, but the goal here is to illustrate that when we talk about managing uncertainty, if you're in one of those like, if at the very minimum you have a clear vision, you have a clear mission stated, and then you have clear metrics that align with those vision and missions, then you are one step closer to having to wrangling the uncertainty. So the way that I like to think about it is like, hey, what is the reason that you exist, like your product team? What value do you bring to the world? And then, of course, like some really good examples here. This is LinkedIn's vision and mission, which I think are just so well put together. So the vision is create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. And then the mission is to connect the world's professionals to make them more productive and successful. So if we were ever in a situation where we were super uncertain about what to build or the strategy around what to build, at the very least, we could look to this. Our vision and mission. Okay, so the companion piece to that is, so vision and mission are great, but what about actual execute? Like when we start articulating what we're going to execute on through this vision and mission. So this is where product principles come in. So product principles are derived from your vision and mission. And they're essentially principles that you can look to when you start thinking about what are we actually building, when the rubber starts hitting the road and we start actually identifying the strategy around our roadmap as we start like defining those pieces. So reduce uncertainty with clear principles. It seems pretty straightforward, but the really difficult part is actually defining the principles because they need to hold up to ideally they shouldn't change. And when they do change, it's very intentional. So some benefits are it provides consistency of not only your product, but also your process. Also provides alignment. So it's super helpful when you're working cross-functionally. So let's say you have a product that you're trying to launch for your team, but it requires some coordination with another team, a partner team, and you are just at odds, right? Like there's this clear misalignment, and that's uncertainty, right? You're like unsure. You're like unsure of, do we move forward? Is this even something that's going to happen? But if you have principles, at the very least, what you can do is point to each other's product principles and sort it out from there. And that will give you a lot of clarity around what to do next in terms of, as I mentioned, both process and product. So from a process standpoint, you could be like, hey, like let's align our strategies here. We've identified that there's a misalignment in our principles. So the next thing we can do is do a clean escalation and take it up the next level. So at least there's some clarity and certainty around what's next, right? But if you're just at odds and you're kind of bickering over little minute details without having product principles, it becomes really difficult to move forward. So here's some example of principles that we had on the My Network team. So help members build and nurture the right network. Help members connect to people they know, and then simplify the experience to minimize product debt. So anything that we did on the page should adhere to these principles, right? So that's just more clarity. More clarity is more certainty. More certainty is less uncertainty. And then finally, for strategy, a really good tactical technique is to, like, quite literally just write down what you know and you don't know. It could actually just be a straight up list. Like you could even have it in like the appendix section of your strategy doc. That's how literal we're talking about this. And so when you talk about knowns, one of the most clear examples of talking about your knowns are talking about your learnings. So a known shouldn't be just something, a known shouldn't be an assumption, right? Like if you're listening at what you know and what you don't know, let's talk about straight up like, okay, last quarter we ramped this thing. We ramped it for 3 weeks and we had to deramp it because we learned X. That's a true factual known, and you can use that and incorporate that learning into your future learnings. And so those things are super helpful when you're defining strategy for the next big project or the next big initiative for your team. And then of course, like identifying the unknowns is equally, if not more important. So writing down, what did you actually learn from previous experiments? What analysis actually proves or disproves some hypotheses that we have? And then my favorite, which is my favorite because it's the most difficult, which is, do we need to revisit our assumptions before building? And an example of this is like, you did have a learning, which it was factual then, but then the product has changed so much since then. So it's like a learning from 2 years ago. Is that actually still true? And so then that becomes a very murky data point to use. So it's good to ask yourself, do we need to revisit our assumptions always? So that's managing uncertainty and strategy. Let's talk about actual execution now. So when we start putting together the roadmap, we start putting together the timelines, tons of uncertainty here, right? So let's start with a problem. PMs are often uncomfortable with giving an ETA of a project or an initiative to stakeholders. And why is this? Because there's so much uncertainty and things change all the time. I mean, I'm talking from experience here. You get, you can often give an ETA and it gets changed so much because of what is either internal or external factors, depending on how you subjectively interpret it. See, already there's so much uncertainty even in that statement. And so in general, like PMs are pretty uncomfortable with giving ETAs, right? So what happens if that is commonplace? Well, then your stakeholders, whether that be your manager, whether that be your cross-functional teams, whether that be like the directors, right? They just start feeling that a project is always postponed and there's not much visibility. Because if you're not giving timelines, if you're not giving ETAs, then they don't know there's not even a reference point. And then if you don't want to give ETAs because it's scary to commit to an uncertain timeline because there's so many open-ended things, then you don't provide, there's basically a lack of visibility, right? And so what that leads to is a reduction of trust, and a reduction of trust leads to an impact, like it impacts your credibility, not only as a product manager, but then it impacts your credibility as a team. And that's like the worst place you want to be, is when the lack of communication around timelines has led to a lack of credibility around your team as a whole. So here's the thing, is like, yeah, it's really scary, but there are very tactical things that you can do to mitigate this problem. So one really good framework is the RAID framework. I would suggest that you actually look for other similar frameworks like this, because there's so many good ones. Obviously, don't get into like a framework overload or anything like that, but it's essentially doing the following, right? It's identifying your risks, identifying your assumptions, identifying your issues, and then identifying your dependencies with every single initiative that you're proposing or working on. This could be as big as like a multi-quarter initiative, but it can also be as small as like a, something that can be built in a sprint. Just by going through this exercise mentally, it's really helpful. But even more helpful is actually laying these all out in whatever doc that you're circulating around with partners. At LinkedIn, we did this literally. Like we literally wrote out like each of these at the beginning of every quarterly planning. At least we did it on our team. And it's different for every team, but this definitely helped a ton with solving for this problem, right? Of like, I'm not sure how we're gonna, articulate or communicate this ETA when we don't know XYZ. Well, if you at least write down each of these things, you'll have something to refer back to, and you'll have something to communicate to your stakeholders. So risks it's pretty straightforward, right? So it's events that will have an adverse impact on your project. So an example of this could be that, maybe we, even though we did some impact sizing for an initiative, there's still a risk that it might not give us the impact that we expected, because you just never know. Honestly, like you never know with user behavior sometimes. So there's a risk there. An assumption might be something like, even though we don't have data to back this up from a previous experiment, we have an assumption based on some other data that may have come in that's not directly related to this. So that's where you'd put your assumptions. Your issues are more around problems that happen while your initiative is in flight. So when you're actually doing the check-ins and you're updating your team, this is where you talk about that. And dependencies are pretty straightforward. It's like, hey, we can't do this unless we have this infrastructure in place, and vice versa. Like there's a whole other team that's dependent on us right now. So RAID in practice, I'll just go through this really quickly. This is an initiative that we ramped, collaborating with the newsletter team at LinkedIn, with the growth team, where we wanted to make newsletters more discoverable. So in practice, it looks like something like this. You first have to scope down and break everything down into smaller tasks. So the first is like, all right, do we even have the backend infrastructure to serve newsletters? Do we have a recommendation engine? Do we have the UI for it? Within the UI, is there a specific like principled way of doing it? Like there's all these different components. Then we estimated each individual task, and then identified the RAID for each of those. And throughout all this, you're following up with each team. There's tons of communication, there's tons of meetings around this, but the goal is to land on the risk assumptions, projected issues, and dependencies for each of the components, and do it in a way that is repeatable. So we had like a weekly Monday morning sync. Is a great way to kick off the week. It's a great way to get everyone in gear to start the week off, and it worked pretty well. So would highly recommend doing something like this. But don't overdo it, of course. You don't want to create more work for yourself. It's just more to keep the monster of uncertainty at bay. Cool. These next ones are a little more nebulous, but essentially it's like expect the unexpected. And I mean, this is like some fortune cookie message, right? but it's true. It's like, even in life, expect the unexpected, but specifically when you're dealing with product management and product development, you should be prepared for multiple outcomes. So don't try to guess directly what's next. Think about all the different possible likely outcomes. So for something like this, right, like this example that we had, the happy path would be that we create the recommendation engine for newsletters. Tons of authors are writing great content. People are subscribing to a lot of great newsletters, right? But in reality, the array of different likely outcomes that we would lay out for this is that that's great that that's a happy path, but let's talk through what could possibly happen and what's probably more likely to happen, which is that we ramp this and it turns out that there are newsletter authors that are gaming the system, let's say, right? And they are producing content that is more frequent, but maybe it's not adhering to exactly the type of content and discovery experience we're looking for. That could be one possible outcome. Another one could be that yes, we do show all these newsletters, but maybe that's not the best way to actually show them. And people, LinkedIn members, don't want to discover newsletters this way. Maybe they want to discover it in a more like in-depth format, and maybe we should make the cards bigger, right? So already, I mean, that's just literally like brainstorming, but you should just be ready for all these likely outcomes. And it's just really good practice. Like, it's just a great exercise for yourself as a product manager. It's a very transferable skill when you are able to look at any initiative and just think through all possible, not all possible, but like a variety of different outcomes. So yeah, over here on the right, reality will look more like this. So definitely anticipate it. All right, so this last piece is more around, uncertainty sucks. Like it is. It just is difficult to deal with, and it's often demoralizing. I've definitely been on initiatives and worked on projects where one of the biggest negative feedbacks was that the thrash of changing priorities, or the thrash of changing requirements, right? So you always want to minimize as much of that thrash and churn when things change, because things are uncertain. And so what you can do is you can create small wins. And so when you do have the certainty, when you do have the actual like small wins that have happened for sure, definitely identify them and make sure they're meaningful and celebrated. Because at the end of the day, you might be able to do all the things well in practice in terms of mitigating uncertainty in execution, but people are people. Like, we're all humans, and it drains us. It drains us when things change and you're asked to do something completely different from what was talked about in your quarterly planning, but it's inevitable. So a really good way to hedge for that is to do this like create small wins type of like culture and practice. So here's screenshots from actual teams that I worked on in the Slack channels, right? It's small, but it's real. It's a lot of visibility, and it's a lot of like basically holding on to the certainty that we do have of things that we did accomplish. All right, so this last section, as I mentioned, I think is the most important, and it's about communicating and managing expectations. The truth of the matter is that product management is a very communication and like people-oriented role, where you're at the intersection of all the different teams, and so communication is super important. It's non-negotiable, right? And more specifically, when we talk about communicating, a big chunk of what you're doing when you're talking to anyone, like let's say it's a 9 a.m. meeting, or it's like a 3 p.m. design sync, like it's about managing expectations. So when we talk about communication, we're talking about broad, communication, but we're also talking more specifically about managing expectations. So yeah, this is tough because creating a culture of accepting uncertainty actually helps. And it's tough to, it sounds a little paradoxical at first, but adopting a culture that accepts uncertainty basically allows PMs to be more proactive in managing expectations, right? So let's consider the opposite for a second. let's consider you have a culture of, hey, if you have a timeline, you better hit it, and we expect that. So if you said this thing is going to be done by October 30th, right? And you don't hit it and you get penalized, or you have some change to be made and you change it halfway to the timeline, then the individuals who are delivering this kind of update are going to have they're going to be less inclined to provide the updates, right? Um, I mean, it just gets a little more difficult. But if you have a culture around accepting the fact that, hey, things change a lot. Of course, we should do everything that we can to prevent the change from happening, both at the very beginning of the project, putting in all our due diligence and efforts to ensure that our projections are accurate, ensure that we have like the right data to back up our hypotheses and assumptions, all the way down to like the very end where we are delivering at a rate and adhering to processes that we've actually defined. If you do that, then if you have a culture around allowing uncertainty in all of these steps, it just makes it a lot easier, because going back to the very first slide, the reality is that the scope and scale and requirements of a project change. They always do. And we can do everything that we can to prevent scope creep. We can do everything that we can to prevent new requirements coming in, but they just do. And having a culture that is flexible and understanding of this truth makes everyone much more flexible. It makes everyone much more, as Nassim Taleb puts it, anti-fragile, which is that you are more resilient to change and you can adapt to change. It's just good all around. So this diagram over the right is a very simplified version of what I believe is the truth, where you have a plan A, it's a happy path. You have a plan B, and you've like prepared for the plan B. But then what often happens is like neither, right? It's just something completely different from both plan A and plan B. So remove this false sense of certainty. Give it your best effort to provide as much certainty as you can, but try to foster a culture of accepting uncertainty on your team. And then the second point, this is really it's a very important point because it's very nuanced. So one of the product management authors and practitioners that I really like is John Cutler. He works at Amplitude. Definitely check out his work. He has tons of really good articles, but he has this really good piece that I think nails this point home in a very nuanced way. It like requires multiple reading because it just captures it in such a way that people don't really talk about, I would say. But clear communication doesn't mean certainty. It means coherence over certainty. And the way that he describes coherence is that it's the ability to navigate and link together the work that you're doing, so the messiness and all the uncertainty, and tell a coherent, persuasive, connected story about how it relates to the larger things you're doing. So just taking a pause for a second, if communication was about delivering certainty, then all your emails, all your Slack messages, all your like weekly syncs would be around delivering like data points, where you'd be like, oh, okay, last week we ramped this thing, we made this much progress, and it's like 30% complete, right? But what that does is it limits what you can communicate, because when the inevitable shit hits the fan and inevitable things change, there's not really a way to talk about that if all you're talking about is like delivering certainty and like just clear things, right? But if your goal is coherence, which is being able to clearly articulate what's happening, whether that be good or bad, and especially when it's bad, then your communication channels just become much richer and they're much fuller of possibility. So as John Cutler put it, people often chase certainty. And the problem is that when you manufacture certainty. So it's basically like trying to put something into, like bullet form when there's actually a problem. Like there's not actually a summary to give. There's actually a problem that you need to communicate. When you manufacture this kind of certainty, then you actually limit coherence. So yeah, this is probably like the most nuanced and toughest point, in my opinion, about communicating and trying to grapple with uncertainty, is being able to very clearly articulate what is happening, whether good or bad. I think as product managers, we're so accustomed to, thinking analytically and thinking structured thoughts, and then delivering those things to, like to our stakeholders, right? Whether it be like in a weekly format, whether it be in a like a ramp email or something like that. It's just always like bullet forms and things like that. But being able to talk about the like super ambiguous and super messy things in a very clear way is like next level. And I mean, this is something that I personally try to improve on daily because it's so difficult. But when you see product practitioners executing at like like a very high level, you see that this is what they do really well. So they don't build false consensus and false certainty, but what they do really well is articulate trade-offs, disagreements, and the interrelatedness between things really well. So yeah, coherence over certainty, I think, is the TLDR of this. And lastly here, always act like an owner. So you should really you should aim to proactively and overly communicate whenever you can. It's not your job to have the correct solution. It's just not. Like as a product manager, you're not supposed to be the person that just like finds the best solution. Sometimes that does happen, right? And it's great, but it's your job to lead the team to find a solution together. And the way you do this is you proactively and overly communicate. Number one, what you do know. Number two, what you don't know, and then what you will know. And so when you do this proactively, you gain trust. It's good for yourself too. Like as you talk about what you don't know, it actually helps you uncover some deeper insights. So yeah, there's this saying, say something 7 times and half your people will say they've heard it once. I think there's actually like a new version of this where they've like actually ran studies and it's like actually 21 times. So the short of this is basically be super proactive in your communication, especially when there's problems and there's ambiguity, and say it a lot because it can only help. Cool. The last bonus slide here is that, like we're talking about managing uncertainty and all that stuff, and it's messy, and this is great for improving our ability to grapple with the messiness. But the flip side of this is that as product managers, what we're actually doing a lot of the times is solving for uncertainty for users. So what do we mean by that, right? So when we talk about like, PM 101, it's like, well, product managers solve problems for others, right? That's great. But it's like, what is a problem? Like, what is a problem actually? So problems are usually identified by like, what's a real need, right? You could have a whole talk about defining good problem statements and all that. So it really comes down to like, what's a real need? And when you think about what real needs and real problems are, they're often caused by pain and frustration. And there's a really interesting idea that's kind of floating around, which is that pain and frustration are often caused by uncertainty. Like when we drill down, like doing kind of 5 whys, like why is this a pain? Well, it's because it causes me frustration when I don't know when my Amazon package is going to come in, right? So this is the example on the right here, this new Obama book. So it's like, all right, well, why is that a problem? Well, because I don't like dealing with uncertainty. Like I'd like to know when this book is going to get here, so that I can schedule my day more easily, right? Same thing with this LinkedIn job application over here on the right. It shows me like I'm in the top 10% of this job, so it gives me a little bit more certainty that I should apply for it, right? Another example is this text message I got from Grubhub that not only that will this meal arrive within 10 minutes in this 10-minute time frame, but when it gets delayed, they give me another update, right? So a lot of the times, not all the times, but a big chunk of the time when we're solving for people's problems as product managers, we're actually solving for uncertainty. So, going back to the very first slide, uncertainty is literally, it's everywhere. And the more that you feel comfortable talking about it, addressing it, and strategizing around it, the better of a product manager you will be. Okay, so final key takeaways. Number one, uncertainty is a reality for PMs. Embrace it. Make it your strength even, because it will be part of your career for your entire career, honestly. Like I think it actually gets even more intense when you're like a director and, when you start getting to the levels where you actually innovate, and you, really push technology forward. There's true uncertainty there. Like there's things that no one has ever done before. So definitely make it your friend and strength. Second is when you talk about uncertainty and strategy, have your true norths and your product principles very clearly defined. Create a habit of identifying knowns and unknowns. When it comes to uncertainty and execution, identify and practice risk assumption, issue and dependency identification. Expect the unexpected, and then celebrate the certain things when you can. And then finally, when you communicate and manage expectations, try as best as you can to create a culture of accepting uncertainty. Sometimes it's difficult when you're like an IC, when you're not leading a team, but you can always do that in your own way, whether that be communicating super proactively, or really just articulating the nuances of uncertainty on the day-to-day, like with your team. Just being like, hey, we don't know this, but this is how we're going to find out. So yeah, those are the takeaways. And yep, thanks so much. Definitely feel free to reach out to me. This is my website. This is my Twitter handle. I'm most active there. So definitely DM me if you have any questions or thoughts. And thanks for coming. Thanks for your time.